were the Muslims in Pakistan. Because the Pakistani state now gave itself the right to decide who is a Muslim. Right? Who is a Muslim? And which Muslims are minorities? Forget the minorities, they say don't exist anymore, but which Muslims are minorities? What about the Wahhabis? What about the Shia? So on and so forth. And the third sect of victims, we're turning the corner, are the Hindus in India. Because the Indian state will decide who is a Hindu. If Hindus are going to have privileges to be enforced by the state, then the state gives itself the right to decide who is a Hindu. Is a Sikh a Hindu? Is a Jain a Hindu? Are the Shivites Hindus? Are the Vaishnavites Hindus? Okay, right now you have this broad coalition called Hindutva. But the project is still being built. Once the project is built, that's the time of fragmentation, disintegration. It's the fight for spoils. You can see Sri Lanka, what's happened to the Tamils. Pakistan, I've just talked about. You can see Iran, the non-Shia population in Iran, right? So this entire region, regardless of what religious persuasion seems to be following a single broad pattern.
I want to return to the book because I think because I think
I want to write another book.
Oh, it looks like it. He's just finished a book on Uganda and Idi Amin as well. So I think now he's got time. So one of the things that I found very particular in your book, I won't say peculiar, was that you talk about the civilizing mission of colonialism, right? I mean, it's something very standard. And you don't talk about extraction, of resources, of material, of the old, from Marx to Lenin and onwards. And it's almost absent in some ways. So it's there, but it's absent. Because you emphasize a great deal, and I'm not saying you're wrong in that, but I just want you to expand on that, because you repeatedly, the frame that you're using for colonialism, and I'll come to some other things around that, is of the civilizing mission, the European modern, early modern forces going and civilizing. And the absence of extraction in your book, of resources being transferred to make the West or the Europe wealthier, is not sort of forefront. Now, it's a different take, so I just want you to expand on that.
Thank you. The classical writings on colonialism, whether it's from 19th century in the Indian subcontinent or 20th century in Africa, have focused on the economic side of the relationship between the imperial power and the colony. It was finally crystallized into a theory of dependency, underdevelopment. Walter Rodney, here in this part of the world, it was known as drain theory. Walter Rodney wrote how Europe underdeveloped Africa. And this became the standard explanation of the crises that followed independence. That we continue to be colonized, the proof is that we continue to be, our resources continue to be drained, continue to be taken by the former imperial powers. At some point, and for me the dividing line was the Rwanda genocide, the question began to change. The question was, okay, this was the history. How come it continues? What happened? And the question began to change from how Europe exploited Africa to how Europe ruled Africa. And what was that system of rule? So it became a more explicitly political question. So I'm not saying that the economic side of the story is not important, it is. But I'm saying simply that this book addresses the political side of the story. So it doesn't claim to be all and end all answering everything, but it does claim implicitly that the politics is primary. And we don't set the politics right, we'll never get the economy right.
And I think that's an important intervention that you make, because you're right that whether the dependency school or whether the Marxists or whatever, they look at economic extraction, whether it's through the IMF, the World Bank, through globalization. And so the other side of it, as you're saying, is often not mentioned by them. So this also leads to another distinction that you make between direct rule and indirect rule. And I think it builds on what you were just saying, that when you talk about the civilizing mission being a direct rule, a direct by colonialism, which leads to an indirect rule, which is usually by the elite who take the role of the colonizer. There's something that you write. You said they take the role of the colonizer once so-called independence takes place. So could you expand on that, because that's in some ways a continuation of the colonial to the post-colonial, supposedly post-independence world. So something about direct rule and indirect rule.
So, you know, in my engagement with the notion of indirect rule was much more in an earlier book called Citizen and Subject. And in Citizen and Subject, I began to explore what was different about colonialism, especially as it moved from India to Africa, and how it developed a set of institutions through which it ruled its new African colonies, and how these institutions were originally cultivated in India, but really expanded full-blown in Africa. And the kernel around which these institutions developed was called custom. And custom was the theoretical innovation of Henry Maine, an English legal anthropologist who was part of the Governor General's Law Commission immediately following 1857. And the usual explanations of 1857 were that, see, the Indians are ignorant, they are superstitious, and that's why they revolted against the civilizing mission. And of course, the question raised in the British Parliament was, well, okay, they may be ignorant and superstitious, which is why you say that they wouldn't use these bullets because it had fat from the cow and the pig. But how come it didn't stop them from using the bullets against us? They used the same bullets to kill us. So Henry Maine kind of responds to this very elementary, vulgar kind of question. But his response is that we made an epistemic mistake in India. We did not understand how India was governed for centuries and centuries. And it was not governed by any modern power at the top. He uses the example of Raja Ranjit Singh in Punjab. And he says, Ranjit Singh could give an order, but his order would not carry any further than where his soldiers were. So there was no sovereignty. In that sense, he had no sovereignty. For the order to carry, it's unlike the British Empire, where the order would carry wherever the empire claimed to govern. But says Maine, the real answer was that Indian villages were controlled by village councils based on custom. And custom is not something which is created, custom is something which is observed. And this notion that the world divides into two kinds of people, one group of people which innovates, improves, legislates, elects representatives who then legislate, is different from the rest of the world, which is governed by custom. And custom is time immemorial. So the claim was that British rule post 1857 was not going to be introducing civilization, progress, but was going to defend and conserve custom from those who would want to disrupt it, from the very people created by British rule in the new educational system, the lawyers, the doctors, etc., who were beginning to lead the nationalist movement. So that was the British claim. Now, that I focused on that in this book, Citizen Subject. But then when it came to writing, neither settler nor citizen, my focus narrowed, not on all the colonies, but settler colonies. And it narrowed on the US as the sort of primary kind of model settler colony. And in the US, I became interested in two things. I became interested in the two different ways in which America governed its two principal minorities. One, African slaves, and two, Indians, American Indians. American Indians from whom they took the land, and African slaves who were the source of labor. So these were the two who provided the basis of what America became later on. But what interested me, again, was the political side, which is the different ways in which they governed them, and the effects of this difference. So they governed Indians through what today we would call a two-state solution. They created a separate state for Indians, not one but many, called reservations.
Divide and rule.
No, not divide and rule. This is far more sophisticated, which will become clear once I explain how they ruled the Africans. So, which meant that Indians were not part of the American polity. They were separate from it. They were a protectorate in the American polity. When the US passed the 1964 Civil Rights Act, that act did not apply to Indians. It applied to African Americans, but not to Indians. So, 4 years later, they passed another act called the Indian Civil Rights Act, which did not give civil rights to Indians as something that can be legally enforced, but only as advisory. Why? Because Indians were not part of the US. Indians were part of a separate polity, a protectorate. What was the difference with the African Americans? The African Americans were part of a single state solution. They were not put in reservations anywhere, they were put in plantations, thousands and thousands of plantations. But they were ruled, they were governed under American law. Indians were governed under what they called custom, by customary authorities, supposedly living in their customary homeland. This was the language of custom, which was not amenable to any kind of democratic practices. But the African Americans were not. So, my interest was, what difference did it make? Well, it made a huge difference. Because with African Americans, you can see, ever since the Civil War, African Americans have been open to building alliances with different groups in the US. Right up to Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter actually became the vanguard of the reform movement. It had nothing to do with numbers. African Americans were a small minority, 15%. But politically, they became a compelling force. Indians remained fragmented, unable to structurally blocked from building alliances. Right. This, I thought, was an important lesson to learn from the American experience. Now, the American experience was exported to different parts of the world. I have a feeling your other questions will have to do with this, so I better stop here.
The question that I was going to, because I want to leave plenty of time for conversation with the audience. The other question, the next question I was going to, was something that is very clear in a lot of your earlier work as well. The presence of violence. And of course, colonialism is an extremely violent act, and so is the nation states created after that. In fact, you write that post-colonial nationalism has been deeply violent, and of course, we live that. So I want to move you away from sort of the history or the pattern which you were describing to the presence of violence and how that creates the citizen, if at all, in this era of, from colonialism, from direct rule to indirect rule, where violence is continues on indigenous people even after the end of colonialism, supposed end of colonialism.
So I was interested in two different kinds of violence. I call one criminal violence and the other political violence. I have a critique of the use of the criminal violence model to understand violence in politics. The prime example is Nuremberg in Germany. So under criminal violence, and you can read this with Human Rights Watch, which is the best exemplar. Okay, for Human Rights Watch, the thing to do in a violent situation is to make is to draw up an account of the violence, identify the perpetrators, name and shame the perpetrators, hold them accountable. So that's what they did in Nuremberg. They identified thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of Nazi perpetrators. General Eisenhower remarked that if we take all of these to court, it'll take us at least 50 years. So they began to denazify those with lower level crimes. ultimately they still came up with a core. And then Adenauer came up with a solution. He said, no, no. Let us support Israel. We will give a sort of an annual subsidy to Israel as kind of blood money for what we did. The counterpart, the corollary of it, was that the Nazis were let go. Right? But the more important corollary was Nazism was defeated militarily, but not politically, because the Nazi political objective was confirmed now. Germany is a nation of Germans, not of Jews. Jews have another nation, Israel. So, they had Germany had Nuremberg. The first reversal to Nuremberg is in South Africa. In South Africa, they recognize, well, first of all, they recognize that they can't really arrest all the perpetrators because they have not defeated them militarily. Right? They are at a standstill. Kind of neither side has won. They realize that they have to have a political solution. They realize that the solution will not come from the courts. Even Steve Biko, who had been killed by police, everybody knew who the police were, which was the station, etc. When his family took the Biko case to court, the court said, no, we will not pronounce on this because at stake is the future of the whole country. So what they had was a political solution, which was, okay, if we agree, we will remain one country. This is a one-state solution. We'll remain one country, and everybody will legally have the same rights. So the South African solution is not criminal. It's a political solution. It has its downside, but we can discuss that if anyone is interested. But it points the world to a different way, and it comes up now, of course, with the Gaza situation and Palestine and Israel and peace, one-state solution, two-state solution, how to deal with the violence. These become real live issues.
I'm glad you came to South Africa. I had a question about Israel as well, but if there's time, we can talk about that. So you write, and I quote, you said the power of the South African story is that it gives us the glimpse of another possibility. Do you still feel that, given South Africa now, after, 30 years of independence, more than that, is that glimpse of another possibility in terms of assimilation instead of in the way that you were just going on about it? It is still, and you write you're an optimist in your book. You claim that you're an optimist, but South Africa offer you that optimism now, still?
Well, I mean, I have no illusions about South Africa. The questions that have not been resolved are the questions of social justice. And they will not be resolved until you have a mobilization around the question of social justice. And you have a political movement which is strong enough to deliver social justice to the people. But what South Africa has given us is on the political side. It's given us on the political side, an antidote to violence, certain kinds of violence. Because if you look at the violence post-independence in the colonized world, sorry, if you look at the violence post-independence in the colonized world, it is basically around the question of who is the nation or who is not the nation, right? Either ethnic cleansing or just disenfranchising. You don't expel them, but you disenfranchise them. And those who are disenfranchised have nowhere else to go. They have no other home. They've been there. They fight back. That's the story of ethnic violence in Africa. That problem was not because of perpetrators. It was a structural problem. It was around issues, and those issues had to be identified and they had to be dealt with. So that's the lesson that South Africa offers us. Thank you very much.
No, that's where we end. Please join me in thanking Professor Mahmood Mamdani. Thank you.